I read a report in The Independent that Michael Gove has been running around this week talking about EU regulations that could be slashed after Brexit. And apparently he gave two lead examples. One was the Clinical Trials Directive and the other was the Habitat Directive. And this is depressing and yet entirely entertaining for a whole suite of reasons. Reason number one, these aren't regulations that you can slash because they're not regulations, they're directives. Habitats Directive, Clinical Trials Directive. Difference between a regulation and a directive being that a regulation is actually a law at the EU level, whereas a directive is an agreement amongst the member states to reach certain targets, and they can solve those by any laws on a domestic level that they like. Point number two, with the Clinical Trials Directive, it's not even going to be around when we leave. The Clinical Trials Directive was upgraded to a clinical trials regulation in 2014, and that comes into effect in 2018 because our countries decided that regulation was the right thing for clinical trials. It standardizes things more. Is this something that we should be scrapping enthusiastically anyway? Well, with the clinical trials regulation, it has been widely praised, including by transparency organizations like All Trials, and so our own sector doesn't even want to scrap it because it's a great upgrade and it solves lots of the substantial problems that we had before. With the Habitats Directive, now there's another one. In 2015, the EU itself was thinking about looking into it to see if it was cost effective, and 100 British wildlife societies said don't you dare touch it. So good luck, Michael Gove, in trying to slash and burn that one domestically. And then finally, perhaps the most ironic one is that if you think that the British can do clinical trials so much better than anyone else, we can do better regulation, we can do better legislation, all the rest, you should know that the revision from the Clinical Trials Directive to the Clinical Trials Regulation in 2014 was led by the Brits. It was dominated by British pharma companies and charities, the UK government. It was even led by a British MEP, Glenys Wilmot, and so it was completely a British reinvention of the clinical trials. So the only reason you would scrap the EU clinical trials regulation and replace it with British opinion is if you think that British opinion wasn't good in the first place. So we are moving from a state of splitting costs across 28 nations and having the lion's share in the say to a case whereby we either subscribe to that from distance, which looks increasingly likely because of other reports, or we reinvent the wheel at our own cost, probably London salaries, and end up just copying what's going on in the EU in order to keep the harmonisation. This is Brexit for you. It's going to be a fun ride.